All right. Well, hello everyone. I'm Alejandro, and I'm going to talk about censorship resistance at the core protocol level. Okay. We're a lean team at the moment, just last day. So thank you for coming. Okay. So who thinks here that Ethereum is censorship resistant? I see. I like. You see a lean team, but you guys know what you guys are talking about. Yeah, it depends, right? It depends. I'm going to argue that not enough. It's not censorship resistant enough. So Ethereum looks a little bit like, bear with me here, big differences, but it kind of looks a little bit like the protocol at the bottom, right? We have 4 proposers here, but there is one that per every slot of time controls ordering, right? So this one can decide not to include some transaction just deliberately, or front run it as well, deliberately. There are some proposals to alleviate that with fossil, with braids, which are interesting. And actually, the braids one is kind of an analogous of what I'm showing in the top protocol, which is what we call multi-concurrent proposers. So in the top protocol, it's also a BFT protocol. What we have is 4 proposers, but they're proposing each one value, one block, if you like. And then they propose it concurrently. There is, in the case of this protocol, 4 binary consensus instances to decide whether we include that block or not. And then a super block is what is decided in this slot, right, in this round of consensus. So no single proposer controls ordering in one single slot of time. So even if one proposer censors a transaction, you can still include that transaction if other proposers don't censor it, and if you have sent it to those other proposers. This is what is called MCP, multi-concurrent proposers. And this is what the SEI guys are doing, Aptos, Hedera, what Braids is for Ethereum, what we're doing at SEI Giga. I'm sure what the pod guys are doing. I'm sure I'm missing a few more, and it's supposed to be the holy grail for censorship resistance. But I'm going to argue that this is not actually real-time censorship resistance. The reason is because of these 3-way trade-off. So actually, let me go a bit forward. So there's basically 3 things that you can do as a user right now in these MCP chains. You can either send the transaction once, and if it gets censored, I got censored, so I lost the arbitrage opportunity or whatever, so I give up, right? I can instead keep sending the transaction to other proposers one at a time, and then I do not get censored, but in every single slot, one single proposer can censor me, so I might get not the expected latency that I was expecting if I wasn't being censored by some proposers. Or I can just send it to more than one proposer, say all proposers, to get the highest level of censorship resistance. And in that case, I'm guaranteed to include this transaction in one slot, what they call real-time censorship resistance, but somebody's got to pay for that, right? So this transaction might appear n times in the chain, and somebody's got to pay for that. And so MCP chains are facing a difficult question. Who pays for that? Is it the system absorbing the cost, or are users going to pay for that? And actually, in production, we already have some MCP chains that are facing this problem, and some of them are facing it differently from others. So on one side, I know for a fact that Falco and SEI or Aptos are just subsidizing the cost. So in the case of SEI, a transaction appears 5 times in the chain. It's a replication factor that they target, but users pay for it once, which means that the throughput, if the throughput is 100,000 transactions per second, the good put, the useful throughput, is actually 20,000 transactions per second, 20% of that. In the case of Hedera, they actually explicitly say that if a user sends a transaction twice, if a transaction appears twice, the user pays twice. And it's interesting that they pay twice even for execution, which the transaction is definitely only executed once, but they pay twice for that. And for ordering, they pay twice, and that's rightfully so. But what that means is that if a user wants to tolerate deterministically 99 proposers censoring the SEI, then he needs to pay for the transaction 100 times. So it's not really affordable censorship resistance, right? Another note is that the reason why this is not a real problem, because the problem with the chains on the right is that this could be exploitable, right? Because it's an attack vector, because users don't pay for the duplication, so they could just keep sending the same transaction concurrently and really decrease the good put without really paying for that. The reason why it's not a problem is because of trusted RPCs. So in the case of SEI, for example, the user sent the transaction to the trusted RPC, and the trusted RPC targets 5 proposers. And so in a way, I like to see the evolution of providing censorship resistance in Web3 in this way. So first, we have leader-based consensus protocols, right? We have one proposer per slot. Great, we have a decentralized system. we have some level of censorship resistance because eventually one of the proposals includes my transaction. Then we realize, okay, you actually, in many applications, you want low latency for this, right? There's always some time sensitivity to when a transaction is included. And that's why MCP is proposed. Then you go one step further, sorry, you go one step further and you realize somebody's got to pay for that, and it shouldn't be the system because then it's an attack vector, and that's what Hedera does. And finally, the work that we have been doing at SEI Giga with the SUI folks is to try to alleviate this cost. And to alleviate this cost, what we're doing is sharding the transaction. So we're dividing the transaction in chunks and sending different chunks to different proposers. We do it with Rateless codes. It's not a very complicated protocol to understand. But let me show you with an example compared to the naive application. So on the left, right here is what NCP systems do at the moment, right? A user sends a transaction with k bits, and if he wants some level of censorship resistance, it sends the same transaction to 3 proposers, let's say. And what that means is that the tolerance to n proposers censoring translates in a fee multiplying by n as well, and also in the good put of the system decreasing by n, by the same factor. If instead you shard the transaction to get the same level of censorship resistance, you actually only have a constant increase in fees, and you also got a constant decrease in good put relative to the throughput. The way the protocol actually, let me go forward a little bit. So the way the protocol works is not that complicated. You basically, the user attaches some metadata to each shard. So it Rateless codes the transaction, it erasure codes the transaction. I'm gonna show different, it's a user-facing protocol, so the user can decide how to shard the transaction, and we have both variants. But basically, it sends some metadata, which is shard, which is a commitment to the transaction. It identifies the shard to a particular transaction. Then in the main version of the protocol, it sends some Rateless, some symbols that from Rateless, from fountain codes in each shard. And the advantage of Rateless codes relative to erasure codes is that you can keep sending new symbols, whereas in erasure codes, you kind of have to commit to how you partition in the transaction in different chunks. And the multiple symbols is what we call a bundle. And so each shard basically contains a bundle of symbols, and each symbol contributes to reconstructing the transaction. And then, we have, with this protocol, calculated what is the probability of single slot inclusion in the presence of some size of an adversary that's trying to censor. Also, what is the theoretical lower bound? So if we had the best protocol with no metadata added whatsoever, what would be the overhead to provide censorship resistance in the best case for any protocol? And we show that we asymptotically approximate that. I'm going to show it in a minute. And then, to determine the execution order, that's also an interesting question. How do you determine the order of a transaction if it comes in kind of like shards, right? And the way we do it is the intuitive way in which the moment the transaction is reconstructible, that's the order of the transaction. So the moment the last shard that is needed for reconstruction, which is a deterministic event, comes ordered, that is the order in the chain of that transaction. And so this is entirely a user-facing protocol that is orthogonal to any MCP chain. Actually, it's even, you can have a single leader chain, you just don't get the advantages because at some point there's one leader that just can reconstruct the transaction and decide the ordering. But yeah, so it's entirely user-facing, and the user has a bunch of parameters that it can decide. So that's the other nice thing about this protocol. The system doesn't need to commit to some kind of like generic notion of censorship resistance. Is the user that can really tweak what is the parameters that make sense for him in terms of what's the adversary that it assumes, what is the cost that he's willing to pay, what is the admissible latency in the worst case given the sensor in size, what is the probability that the adversary, because another nice thing that you get with this is for some definition of privacy, you get some privacy because proposers don't really get the transaction until they reconstruct it. There's some leaking there, and one of our future work that we're working at the moment is to get non-linear leaking in the number of shards that you get for reconstruction. So basically not be able to reconstruct the transaction, to leak any information about the transaction until the proposers have so many shards that they basically are close to reconstructing the transaction. But the point is, if you cannot reconstruct the transaction, you cannot even extract MEV. So that's another parameter that the user can decide, which is different from censorship resistance. And on Tuesday, I presented the analysis, the economic analysis of that, how much MEV, what basically was the cost to protect a transaction from MEV, depending on the extractable value of the transaction with this sharding approach. And yeah, so then we provide some safety properties, which are intuitive, non-malleability, unique decode, and the deterministic order that I was talking about. And what we see here at the bottom is some probability of the transaction being reconstructed in the presence of an adversary that controls 1 out of every 8 proposers, and at least 1 is censoring. So 12.5% of the proposers are censoring, depending on how many, on the x-axis is basically how many proposers you send a shard to, and how many symbols per proposer, so how big of a shard you send. There's a difference on the left axis, the left plot and the right plot. On the left plot is because the transaction size is bigger. So you actually send, you need to send more symbols per proposer in order to reconstruct the transaction with less lanes. That's why the kind of like sigmoid increase happens later when you contact more lanes. But of course, on the right side, what we see is, well, on the left side, what we see is the more lanes you send per shard, obviously the easier it's going to be to reconstruct the transaction as you send to more proposers, like as you send more shards, because you're just sending more symbols in the network. On the right side, what we see is obviously that the naive replication case pretty much has a success probability that is overwhelmingly high, but you need to pay for each duplicate. And I'm going to show a little bit more of that later. I already talked about this. Okay, this is probably the most interesting plot of the talk, I think. And this is exactly what I was talking about before, on the cost of providing censorship resistance. So this is for, again, for a censorship size of 12.5% of the proposers trying to censor the transaction, but we don't know which ones, so we're sending duplicates, or in the case of the sharding solution, shards at random to some of the proposers. And on the x-axis is the size of the transaction in bytes, and on the y-axis is the metadata overhead. So how much extra data are we sending just to provide censorship resistance? And we're comparing it with the naive case, which is what we do now in MCP chains, what you can do in Aptos in SEI, just replicating the transaction. In the case, for example, of the highest blue point is a replication factor of 5.5. And then as the payload size increases, how this alleviates the cost, the overhead cost to provide censorship resistance through sharding, and how it approximates actually the information theoretic lower bound, which is quite nice. And already, for a transaction size of just 10,000 bytes, it already is a dramatic decrease in cost for users to actually tap into censorship resistance. And on top of that, also get MEV protection. Of course, this is now just a sharding proposal, and of course, depending on how big of an adversary you want to tolerate censoring you are going to need to send more shards. But the important bit is that this cost also alleviates dramatically. I need all of them for whatever adversary just asymptotically converges to the information theoretic lower bound. And now latency. So how much does this add extra? Because you need to reconstruct the transaction. Well, intuitively, for some of the people in the room, for sure, actually, sharding a transaction can help with latency because you are using multiple channels, and so you are not overloading a particular networking channel. And actually, that's what we have experimented in our test, that for some cases, when the transaction is big enough, it's actually better to shard the transaction for latency than it is to just send the transaction naively to a number of proposers. But anyways, this is like ridiculous latency, and it's ridiculously parallelizable as well. We're talking about 1 to 3 milliseconds in all cases. So this is a strong advantage of sharding a transaction compared to threshold encryption and decryption. Because as I was saying, this is not just about censorship resistance, but also MEV protection. And so and privacy, or until decode privacy. And so there's like some interesting comparison with threshold encryption, but threshold encryption increases a little bit more the latency. Apart from one more problem that we have found with threshold encryption is that in many cases it relies on non-standard cryptographic assumptions. And we actually, I don't know if it's out yet, but if not, it's going to be out soon, a paper in which we proved that some of these standard assumptions are actually broken. So the threshold encryption schemes are not safe. They don't provide the properties that they say they provide. I already mentioned as well that part of the future work we're working on is providing non-linear leaking per shard that you obtain. And the other one is also the first economic model on how to price the amount of data that each proposer is distributing in this multi-concurrent proposer design. And so, yeah, that's it now. I hope you agree with me that current chains are not in a censorship resistant or MEV protected in an affordable way and a trusted way, and that something like sharding transactions are just necessary to provide real trustless censorship resistant systems.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about potential drawbacks of this solution. For example, I'm wondering if there is a potential scenario where many transactions become decoded at the same time, deterministically, if there's deterministic rule, like you said, that might create like a huge burst of load that has to be executed very quickly. Could this be a problem?
That is an interesting question. Yeah, so you're saying like one block where suddenly you have, right, so in the typical, imagine, if you send a transaction, if I'm understanding what you're saying, like in the typical case, if you have no duplication whatsoever, then maybe your throughput will be 200,000 transactions, but because now the shards divide divide by some fraction the size, then you can have actually, if you divide this by 5, then you can have actually 1 million transactions per second in one instance. Right. That is a very interesting point. I have not thought about that, but that's definitely something to think about. That could create a bottleneck on the already bottleneck execution. So yeah, that's a very good point. Another disadvantage that is immediate is shown here. Like you need, if your payload size is very, very small, you might be better off just duplicating your transaction, because there's some metadata that you have to add. Yeah. By the way, this is, again, that's a good point because it affects the system. The other point I said is, as I said, it's completely a user-facing protocol. So it's not about forcing down the throat of the user or anything. It's just giving more options for the users to choose what are the properties that it wants to tolerate.
Thanks. What sort of thing would be in the metadata? Would that allow censorship resistance? Would it be data that could be used to...
Excuse me, say that again?
Sorry, what sort of thing would be in the metadata attached to the shards? Yep. Would it be something that would enable censorship or could be used to decide to censor?
Well, it would be something that allows you to identify, okay, depends on how you do it, right? Like this is more researchy yet, it's not engineering yet. So it does depend on how you do it, but basically what you note in the metadata is a way to identify, to link together charts. So like some commitment that links them together to the same transaction, and a way to prove that someone has enough balance to pay for the ordering of this. And then how much you want to leak, or are you admissibly leaking from that is something that we haven't thought about, but of course there's different approaches that will leak more or less information on the metadata. Yeah. Also a very good point. Yeah.